Hello, and welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto, attorney at law in the state of Michigan, where I've been practicing law for 24 years in the fields of consumer protection and lemon law. I'm a frequent writer for Jalopnik's subblog, The Garage, and from time to time I write for Opposite Lock as well. Today's question is, why not sell a car to a relative? It's a hypothetical, rhetorical question, just like when I said, don't buy an RV. In that podcast, I said specifically, you can buy one, you just got to know what you're doing. And I got a lot of angry emails and so on from people who didn't actually listen to the podcast or watch it. They simply responded to the headline. So when I say why not sell a car to a relative, I'm not saying you can't. What I'm saying is things you need to be aware of, because I get a lot of phone calls in my office, a disproportionate number of calls from people who either bought a car from or sold a car to a relative, and bad things happen. So this is stuff to watch out for should you be thinking about buying a car from or selling a car to a relative. The number one problem I encounter is people call my office, they say, Steve, I bought a car from a relative and it broke down. What can I do? Now, this doesn't take rocket scientists to realize if they're calling an attorney, things might be going bad at your next family reunion. Now, I usually tell them there's not much you can do. If you bought a car from an individual, relative or otherwise, that car is bought as is. It means that you bought it with all faults and no warranties. People say, well, Steve, what if the guy knew it was going to break down and he sold it to me that way? Well, then you might have a case, and of course you have to sue a relative. These are the questions you need to ask yourself before you sell a car to a relative. What will happen if they call me a week from now, a month from now? I've had people say, hey, I bought a car 6 months ago and it blew up. I think the guy knew it was going to blow up on me. Now, you and I both know that it's probably pretty hard to predict that, but of course, if the person thinks that, then you might have problems dealing with them in the future. So ask yourself what's going to happen if you get that phone call. And by that phone call, I mean them calling you up and saying, hey, Uncle Bob, that car you sold me 3 weeks ago, it just threw a rod. Can I have my money back? Okay? What are you going to say then? You're going to say, hey, dude, talk to Steve Lehto. You bought that thing as is, sucker. I mean, you might not be able to make that phone call with a relative. So be aware of that. If it breaks down, bad things can happen. And I've seen this so many times, it's scary. Number two, people often tell me that they are disappointed in the price they paid for a vehicle after they bought it because they think they got ripped off. Now, if I'm selling you a car and I don't know who you are, arm's length transaction through Craigslist or eBay or some other means, okay? I'm going to try to get as much money for my car as I can, and you're going to try to pay me as little money as you can. We're going to negotiate. That's what the marketplace does. The problem with negotiating with a relative is I've seen it go both ways. I've seen somebody say, I gave my relative a really, really good price in the car because they're my relative. And I've also had someone call me and say, I think this guy took advantage of me because he's my uncle or my relative. Okay, whatever the relative is. I don't want to pick on anyone in particular. Many people don't think they can negotiate with a relative, and many people can't. It's part of the family dynamic. So be aware of the fact that if you sell a car to a relative, unless you give them a really, really good price, there's a chance that they might be thinking in the back of their minds later, hey, I got ripped off. Aunt Connie ripped me off. Who knows? So be careful about those things. But again, look at the price. Try to do what you can to find a decent way to measure the price. But even that, go to kbb.com. Kelly Blue Book says, well, there's a clean price and a rough price. You think you're entitled to the clean price because you're the seller. They think they're entitled to the rough price because they're the buyer. And how do you negotiate that with a relative? So that could be a problem. So the price itself might be a problem between relatives. Now, the biggest problem I ever actually encounter regarding money is whether or not payments get made. And this is a problem among relatives. A lot of people actually say, gee, Uncle Bob, I'd like to buy your car from you, but I can't afford it right now. Uncle Bob, being a nice guy, says, you know what? Take the car right now. Just pay me when you can. Many people turn the phrase, pay me when you can, into, I just got a free car, or I'll pay you somewhere down the road, but even I know it's not going to happen. So people call me, they say, Steve, I sold a car to my relative, and my relative's got my car now. They even retitled it in their name, but they never paid me the money. What can I do? And I say, well, unfortunately, it's similar to you lending money to a relative. They now owe you money, but there's only so much you can do because they're a relative. Now, I've actually seen people sue relatives before. It's not fun. It happens. I've seen big family squabbles erupt over things like this. But what do you do if they don't pay you? So when you're going to sell a car to a relative, or you're buying a car from a relative, make sure that the buyer can afford to buy the car at the seller's price. And if they can't, think long and hard about letting them buy the car and pay for it later, because that often results in the same thing as if they just lent you the money or that you lent somebody the money and there was no way of making sure they paid you, okay? So how do you get the money out of them later? Now, this also happens. I've had people tell me they bought a car or they sold a car on payments to a relative. That is, Uncle Bob, I can't afford the car right now, but I'll pay you $100 a month till the car is paid off. Now, I've known people who did that successfully. They sold a car, they bought a car using payments to a relative, and it worked out. That can happen, and things often do happen well. I don't hear about them at my office because I'm an attorney. People call me with problems. People rarely call me and say, Steve, I'm having a good day. Just wanted to tell you about it. Okay? In fact, I've never gotten that phone call. But, so, people call me. They say, Steve, I sold a car to somebody. It's a relative, and they're supposed to make payments, and they stopped making payments. What can I do? And I tell them, well, unfortunately, same thing. They owe you money now. What else can you do? Now, people often wonder if they can repossess the car from the person they sold it to if the person stops making payments. There is a method where you can do that legally, but it usually involves you doing something like creating a security interest and drawing up a contract that spells out payments and describes the collateral and conforms to Uniform Commercial Code. I've only met one person in 24 years who did that properly, and I wrote an article about it. I had a client who sold a car to a relative by marriage. It was an old Corvette. Just Google the phrase Jalopnik Lehto Corvette. You'll find 3 different stories about Corvettes, and that's one of them. And my client sold the car to this guy. Guy started making payments, and then he stopped when my client had a breakup with the woman who was related to this gentleman. And so apparently the gentleman thought, well, I don't have to make payments anymore because she's not getting along with him anymore, and that somehow voids the contract. But I'll keep the car. That's not how it works. And when my client explained to me that, hey, by the way, Steve, I sold this kid this car, and he's making payments to me, my first thought was, oh, boy. He sold the car to a relative. And he goes, but I have this document here. I had him sign. And the document described the collateral, described the payment plan, and my client had gone so far as to have himself listed as first lien holder on the certificate of title with the state of Michigan, which is pretty much the only way to do it legally. And I thought to myself, wow, I can't believe the guy did this. So we ended up getting a lawsuit going, and we got the money. Sadly, it went all the way to the Michigan Court of Appeals because of a really crazy judge up in Port Huron. But that was one case where we actually got the money, but it involved litigation. So you don't want to be litigating amongst family members. Most people don't like that. In fact, most people don't want to litigate amongst non-family members. It's even worse with family members. And I've seen family members suing each other. I don't take cases like that, but I hear about them all the time. So if somebody says to you, I want to buy your car, can I pay you later? Stranger or a relative, you gotta say no, unless you can actually afford to live without that money for a while, possibly forever, because that could happen. Somewhere down the road, you're gonna be faced with a choice. Do I sue my niece or my nephew to get the money, or do I write the money off? I've had people tell me that they were owed money by relatives, large sums of money, and when push came to shove and they were threatened, with a lawsuit, it caused a rift in the family, with people actually siding with the person who owed the money, saying, you can't sue them, they're relative. It's like, well, yeah, but if he owes tens of thousands of dollars he's never going to pay back, got to do something here. So be aware of the fact that if you're going to let the person make payments or pay you later, it might never happen, and you wouldn't do that with a stranger, but what are you going to do with a relative? So that's a problem, okay? Now, another problem that often pops up is that in Michigan, there's a thing called owner liability, and it exists in most states, and that is that a person who owns a vehicle is liable for things that happen with that vehicle. Short of extreme circumstances. So I lend you my car, you go out and run somebody over with it. Well, you'll get sued as the driver, I'll get sued as the car owner. And that is a problem for car owners. Now, when you go to sell a car to somebody, I preach about this all the time, and although I rail about it, people often ignore my advice, but you've got to make sure the title gets transferred into the buyer's name. Now, Michigan advises you to go with the buyer to the Secretary of State's office, so you, them, and the Secretary of State's office can all do the paperwork at the same time, and you walk out of there, it's titled in their name, you're good to go. Now, people complain to me, they say, hey, Steve, California and a few other states allow you to do this all online. You tell them you sold the car and to whom, you're covered. Well, I got news for you. I've spoken to people who've been sued in those states where you can do this online. So what happens is they notified the state the car had been sold, but the buyer didn't notify the state. So the state kind of left the file half open, waiting for the other information to come in. Car got in an accident, and a fancy pants attorney out there says, okay, who owns the car? They run the title, and they go, hey, check it out. We got 2 people we can sue now. So the person got sued. So you want to do what you can to make sure the title gets transferred. For some odd reason, a lot of people when they're dealing with relatives think, oh, I don't have to worry about this that much because it's a relative. So you sell the car to your relative, hand them the title and the keys, and they drive off in it, and they get in an accident. And the police report has a VIN number. The VIN number gets traced back to the state, and an attorney looks up and goes, hey, it wasn't owned by this person who's driving the car. It was actually owned by the person who sold the car earlier, but there's no record of the sale. Now, you can go to court and defend it and say it wasn't my car, I sold it to them. But the problem is you don't want to be in that situation. So I've spoken to people before who said they had a problem because they sold the car to a relative who didn't retitle the car. Often they didn't retitle it because they don't want to pay the taxes on it, or they didn't want to have to worry about the registration of the plates and the insurance, things of that nature, which are other problems we'll talk about in a second. But the point is that if you did this transaction with a stranger, you'd get the car plated and insured and titled properly. You've got to do that with a car that you sold to a relative, unless you really think, hey, I don't care, it's a relative, I don't mind being sued on their behalf. But most people don't like being sued regardless, let alone for somebody else's accidents, okay? So when you sell the car to a relative, make them retitle it the same way you would with a stranger, because the exact same laws apply. You can't go into court and say, but Your Honor, it's my niece, okay? The judge is going to say, guess what? You should have gotten the vehicle titled properly when you sold it. Another problem with relatives, for some odd reason, is a lot of relatives don't mind letting other relatives drive on their license plates. I've spoken to a lot of people who said, I sold a car to my relative who said he didn't have time to go out and do this, or he didn't have the money or whatever, and left my plate on the car and then went off and bad things happened. Again, people only call me because bad things happen. I had a client called me up and said, Steve, craziest thing happened. My relative was driving my car late one night, and I got a phone call from the police. It actually, they came and knocked on her door and said, we were curious to know if you know where your car is. And she said, well, I don't have that car when they described it to her because I sold that car to my relative. And they said, well, here's the problem. That car just caused a bunch of property damage not too far from here, and it wound up in a ditch, and we traced the plate to you, okay? So my client, who'd been rousted from bed at like 3 o'clock in the morning, actually had to, put on her clothes and go to the police station and straighten this mess out. And she knew darn well who was driving the car because she had sold the car to that relative not too long before, but the car still had the plate on it, and I suspect the title and everything else hadn't been transferred over either. A big, big mess, but again, she was doing a favor for a relative, and we all know what happens. You do favors for people, they often come back and bite you. So again, when you sell the car to a relative, you're going to make sure that they plate it, title it, and do everything, including put insurance on it, okay? Now, insurance is not that big of a deal if they've done everything else. In other words, you sell the car to your relative, and they title it and register it, and they plate it properly, and they're driving down the road with no insurance. At that point in time, it's their problem, okay? But you got to make sure that if the other things aren't taken care of, that's when you start worrying about things like insurance. Now, a lot of the problems I'm talking about here are also very, very similar to things that happen with co-signers and co-lessors or co-lessees, okay? So in other words, I've had people call me up, they say, hey, Steve, I have a relative who couldn't afford to buy a car, okay? Couldn't afford to lease a car. So I co-signed for them, okay? And now I'm getting this hate mail from Ford Motor Company, Chrysler Credit, and so on, saying that I owe this money and they're going to start doing bad things to me if I don't pay this money because these payments are late. What can I do? And I say, well, unfortunately, what you could have done is read that document you were signing that says, I am co-signing a loan for somebody else, and I understand that if this loan goes into default, you can come after me first. That's the crazy thing. A lot of young people get older relatives to sign documents for them as co-signers and so on. And a lot of people say, I'm doing this person a favor, I'm co-signing a loan. And they assume that the lender will go after the driver or possessor of the car first before going after the co-signer, when in fact the law and the contract specifically say if they want to, they can go after you first. You're the deeper pocket. And that's what a co-signer does. A co-signer puts their neck on the line to the same extent as the other signer, but keep in mind that the lender has the right to go after either one of you at their choice. And more often than not, they're going to say, well, guess what? The person driving the car was making payments and stopped. They're probably a deadbeat. Now let's go after the other person who's probably a parent or nearby relative who makes decent money, and they were foolish enough to co-sign, but we can go after them anyway. I've seen some horrific cases where parents got nailed having to pick up the cost for a kid who didn't honor the contract and let the payments fall behind in a vehicle. Crazy, crazy things. Vehicles, no insurance on them, get totaled out, and the kid disappears. Next thing you know, a parent is paying off the loan on the vehicle that got wrecked that had no insurance on it. Nightmare scenarios like that. So when you're signing or co-signing a loan for a relative, think of these things as well. It's not quite the same as selling or buying a car to or from a relative, but it's something that pops up with cars and relatives and so on. So these are the same kinds of problems. I've had people come in and say, Steve, I co-signed a loan for my relative or a friend, worse, and they're out driving the car around, they stop making payments on it. Now, I've tried calling them to say, hey, why aren't you making payments? They won't take my phone calls. That's the funny thing about today's modern technology. They can see who you are when you call. So when they don't take your phone calls, you know they're doing that. It's not that they weren't there and were too busy to pick up their cell phone, okay? They were looking at it going, oh gosh, he's calling again. I bet he's pissed off about me not making payments in the car. People say, Steve, can I go and repossess the car? And I say, that's the weird thing. You don't have a possessory interest in the car. The bank does. The bank can repossess the car, but it's unclear if you can go do that because of the fact that you simply co-signed a loan. In other words, you simply agreed to accept a huge portion of liability, but you didn't actually get any of the protections that the bank has, because the bank can, to cover themselves, repo the car, sell it at auction, create a deficiency, then chase people all day long until the deficiency gets paid. The bank will get their money back, but you, the co-signer, probably won't. So that's the danger of doing that. So again, these are reasons that you may not want to sell a car to a relative or buy a car from a relative. Don't get me wrong, you can, as long as you're aware of the pitfalls, but the pitfalls are many and varied. Same thing with co-signing a loan for somebody. Be aware of the fact that if you co-sign the loan, the bank can come chasing you first if the other person stops making payments on it. So anyways, that's what you do when we're talking about whether or not you should ever buy or sell a car to or from a relative. Questions or comments, feel free to fire my way at my website, lehtoslaw.com, LEHTOSLAW.com. I'm on Twitter at Steve Lehto, at STEVELEHTO, and I'm on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Thanks for watching and listening. Bye-bye.